Welcome back to Builders of the Broken Bazaar. I'm your host, Dr. Tabish Zaman. Now, on this podcast, we have been talking about entrepreneurship as survival. But today, we're going to talk about something called collapse. Now, I'm not talking about collapse of infrastructure or markets, but the collapse of empathy inside the very technologies that run our world. For years, we've been told that technology is neutral. The algorithm, the code, it has no politics. It's all about platform which simply connects people. But anyone, and I say anyone paying attention, knows that it's a myth. Take AI alone. In 2024, nearly 44% of the facial recognition system, which was tested by NIST, it showed relative racial bias. Algorithms which are deciding who gets a job, who gets a mortgage or medical care now, which influences the lives of over 4 billion people every day. Yet most are trained on data set that completely erase entire communities. Again, when we talk about accessibility, around 1 billion people worldwide, they live with some form of disability. But again, the interesting thing is less than 3% of the website, they meet even the basic accessibility standards. So technology doesn't just connect, it decides in today's world. It decides who gets seen, who disappears, and who gets served, who's silently locked out. So entire communities, they remain invisible, not because they are small, but because someone, somewhere decided they didn't matter enough to design for. And my guest today has spent his entire career refusing that blindness. He has challenged the myth of neutrality, reminding us that every line of code, the algorithm, is a moral choice. Glenn Block is not just a technologist, he's a reformer, I would say, inside one of the most powerful industries on earth, the founder and CEO of ProdSense. Glenn leads with a radical belief that product design can and must be a tool for equity. And before building ProdSense, I'll give you a bit of a background. He has shaped products and cultures at some of the world's most influential technology companies: Microsoft, Splunk, Auth0, DocuSign, where billions of users have felt the impact of his work without knowing his name. But today his mission is no longer about building products that scale. It's about building systems that care, which is at the heart of this podcast. And his philosophy is very single, very elegant idea, I would call it. He calls it product equity. The belief that when you design for those who don't feature in a broader conversation, you build something better for everyone. That equity is not a feature, but a foundation. Not charity, but strategy. Glenn, welcome to Builders of the Broken Bazaar.
Thank you, Dr. Zaman. What an amazing intro, and not entirely true. So I would not say my entire career, because part of my career was living in blindness, essentially, that these problems even existed. Of course, I'm raised as, a white guy with a lot of privilege, and often this blindness exists because the people that are not affected don't see it. And of course, this goes well beyond technology, but definitely for the last 10 to 15 years. And some of this came out of coursework when I did my executive MBA at Seattle University, where I started to really just understand about how these technologies that we're building are causing a lot of harm, often to people that are underserved. And again, because of a lot of the dominant cultural narratives and systemic issues that some today deny exist. Of course, the people denying it exist are not the ones that are affected. That's always how it goes, and so it continues. Yeah, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you. Excited for the conversation.
Now, the reason why I mentioned the sort of work you have been doing and how you've been looking for that blind spots, again, you mentioned 10, 15 years. We need to amplify the work which you do, and it needs to reach out to as many people across different disciplines. So, I've taken the liberty of talking to Glenn in a way which really sort of encapsulates a lot of different disciplines. So let's start with the foundation of your
Well,
work,
I
if you
just want
don't
to
mind.
say I might steal that line that you said about like creating systems that care,
Hmm.
because I think that's so powerful. And, one of the challenges, even with the terminology that I use today, especially living in this country, is there is a huge effort to try to deny that those terms even make sense, that there's any disproportion between people from different backgrounds, etc. But finding terminology like the word care, right? Like, I think that's very powerful. So I appreciate that you said that.
Yeah, I think it can get lost in the abstractness, but then
Hmm.
individuals like yourselves, when you come on board with all the work you've done, it really gives it a powerful meaning, which is why I used it. So I really want to get on with your foundation of the work. So
Sure.
again, looking at everything which you have done, you clearly say that technology is not neutral. Again, it reflects in the work you've done, and you worked inside some of the biggest tech companies which I just named. So the question for me is, what made you realize that industry's claim, again, the neutrality, in fact, was a form of privilege, if I may say so?
Yeah, it's a great question. First off, just want to mention, like, I started off my journey into technology as a software engineer, right? So people will be like, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about." Like, I started coding when I was 7. I still code, so I've been coding 40 years, right? And probably was one of those people that would have stood on the side early on of like, "Hey, zeros and ones know no bias." And that is true. I stand behind that. That's true. But the
Hmm.
myth in that is like, yeah, but the way those zeros and ones are assembled can be done in a way that makes them work in a biased fashion. So it's like, sure, 0 and 1 are not biased, but 0 and ones put together form a system that can be biased. And the person who put those 0 and ones together has a lot to do with how that system will function.
Hmm.
I'm built on, my work is built on the backs of many amazing people. So it's not, I think what it was is me slowly waking up to recognizing work that other people have been doing that have been exposing these things. It wasn't like some, there's so many people I could call out. More recently, one person I'll call out that I talk a lot about is Dr. Timnit Gebru, who has, really exposed a lot of things. People like Dr. Ruha Benjamin, who have been, leading the way. Joy Buolamwini, who wrote this book, Unmasking AI, who has talked a lot about also vision technologies, as you mentioned. Um, I think for me, a lot of my journey to learn about the inequities in technology started with my learning about the inequities in society in general. And so when I talk about like 15 years ago, I really started on this kind of anti-racism journey, learning in this country about especially how Black people have been treated, the inequities that exist in our society, learning the truth about enslavement and what and just white supremacy, and going all the way back to Europe and where these ideas started. And so it all started there. And then, as you start to like learn that the world is not what you thought it is. And one of my favorite movies I talk often about is the movie The Matrix, because I talk often about like this red pill versus blue pill moment. And this, I think for me, what resonated so deeply about that movie is when I started to kind of swallow the red pill, I really realized that, as like a white person in this country, I live under the blue pill. I live under a different reality than people of color, than Black people in this country. And of course, now we can extend it to anybody from the global south, right? It's a
Yeah.
different experience. So the more I started to lean into that as a human and trying to understand that, hey, like, I live in a world where I do have privilege. Um, Peggy McIntosh's The Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack was a groundbreaking read for me, which just really elucidates the 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 uh, the disparities. Like, what are the things that me as a white person doesn't even have to think about? And I'll give one really prominent example is when um, it was a period in our country when there was a lot of noise, and it's continually happening, but there was so much noise about in the media around Black people who were getting killed by police. And I remember distinctly this conversation about the talk being a conversation that Black people have with their children. Here's how you should behave if you're ever pulled over by a cop. And at the time, I had a friend who was African American that I talked to. His name actually is Michael Brown. And of course, Michael Brown was in the news because police had killed him. But this is a different Michael Brown. And I said to him, is this real? And he's like, yes. And I was ignorant at that time. And he's like, yes, we all. And it was just a moment for me where I realized I would never have this conversation. My parents would never have this conversation with me because I am never going to be pulled over. So I don't need to know how I should react if I'm going to be pulled over. So it's like things like this that started to tear away and be more of my red pill moment. And then just starting to dig much deeper, learning about Jim Crow, learning about how, yes, enslavement on the books was gone, but it was still very much alive and well. And how, even in our amendments, the 13th, like how we enable, like basically enslavement is still actually alive if you're convicted and in the prison industrial complex. And then seeing how once that loophole was created, all the laws and the way that the police operate, et cetera, to make sure that the primary people that are going through that are the same people that were previously enslaved, only there's a new way to do it. So, all of this kind of unlearning and education is what kind of opened me up to start to realize that, you just need to question everything. And that was what eventually led me to being starting to question technology. And I remember hearing a lot about vision related things, like Black women who were using websites where uploading passport, for example, and it can't identify them. I remember during my executive MBA learning about a Black man who had photos in Google, Google Photos that were identifying him and his girlfriend as monkeys. Right? Like all these technologies. And then as I started to really drill more into it, I realized that, look, reality of it is the people that are making the majority of decisions about technology are not the ones that are affected by these decisions. So they don't change the way that they operate. They're not asking questions. They're making assumptions. A big one was, around the time of COVID, the oximeter. The oximeter is a physical device that is used for measuring the oxygenation of blood. And when somebody has COVID, they will often, especially if it's considered a case where they're worried about more severity, they will tell them to use the oximeter. Well, the oximeter, it turns out, is biased. This is that great example of that zeros and ones. It does not work well for people with dark skin. It has been proven as a fact that it will give misreadings that will lead you to believe that there is less severity of the situation of the person who is using the oximeter. That means that people likely died or were seriously harmed because of invalid readings on a device, right? Now, that device is not biased. Yes, it is. Because why? Because who was it tested against? It was tested against people with light skin. I'm the default. That was the thing I really learned. Systems will always work for me because those systems will not ship if they don't support my needs, because I am part of the dominant culture. So anyway, that's a lot, but it was
so is that why you
pulled
went to
on all
war?
these threads.
Yeah. So is that why you say about the neutral design in terms of, and again you gave us some examples of the societal issues which you saw in front of you unfolding, whether that was during your MBA and as you went through, but from your own sort of work, your own career, which you saw in front of you playing out, uh, you know, uh, you might have felt a product is working out absolutely fine, but then you saw it impacting others in a completely different way. So, did
Yeah,
it actually challenge your notion of, neutral design is hiding the technology, basically who it is
I
built
think
for?
neutral design is really just a dominant culture appeal.
Mm-hmm.
The people that, and I, the people that are often saying they're doing neutral design are often coming from a lens that is not neutral. It is
Mm-hmm.
appealing to the default. And I think there's so much proof of this. A great example I'll give that is, so it's not only about harm, it's also about missed opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so Cash App is a banking app.
Mm-hmm.
And if you ask the average person, and again, this is biased in itself, but let's use is there an average person? By the way, this is a huge problem. We believe there's an average person. There is no average person. Average person already has bias in it, but I'll just go with it because I'm a victim often of the things I'm trying to push up against. So if I was just say, like, let's think about the average person, you'd probably be like, the average person has a bank account.
Mm-hmm.
There's tons of problems with that. But all of the payment services out there, like PayPal and these other things, all started with the assumption that you have a bank account. But guess what? There's a major population that is underbanked or unbanked,
Yeah.
either by decision because they don't trust the system. They want to not operate. They want to operate outside of the visibility of the banks. And there's many reasons to have that mistrust, of which I've been mostly immune from, but that doesn't change that it exists. Or there's people that just can't get bank accounts. Well, a lot of those payment services that were out there were just unreachable. They
Mm-hmm.
couldn't use those services because of systemic issues in our society, as well as biased decision making. So Cash App, one of the things they came out with was this idea that we want to support the underbanked and the
Mm-hmm.
unbanked. So they thought about it. And
Mm-hmm.
honestly, a lot of the biases that exist in our technologies would not be there if we just started with questioning assumptions and
Mm-hmm.
thinking about it. But this is a great example of where Cash App has done so well. So it's not just about removing harms that could result in liability and getting a bad name. It's actually about they uncovered a whole new segment of people they were able to serve. Okay, this sounds really bad. Those people existed, but many of the products were missing the mark, and they were able to address it because they were intentional about it. They thought about it and said, how can we design to make sure that this community is served? And so I want to call out a book that I love. It's called Design Justice. And design justice is built on the backs of many others. But the idea in design justice is focus on those who are the most likely to be left out. And what the
Mm-hmm.
data shows is when you do that, and I've talked about this on another podcast as well, you end up addressing problems that help the masses essentially. If you cater to those who are the most likely to be harmed, you actually end up doing things that help the masses. And I think there's a lot of data that shows this.
So, why do you think there is less of an uptake when it comes to looking at the sustainability of these technologies which are built, and especially integrating ethical technology within which the systems are built or the applications are built? Um, And in your own case, was there a moment, and again, you gave us an example, but was there a moment as you were getting along to see that, building a great technology is not just enough? We need to be talking about ethical systems and ethical processes.
Ethic and equitable. So the reason I choose the word equitable, like there's a lot of people that use words like inclusivity. By the way, I didn't come up with product equity. That is a
Mhm.
term that has been evolving There've been books, it's something that over the last couple of years has really gained steam. There's actually a conference in DC on product equity that I attended. Adobe talks a lot about product equity, so it's not a new term, and it's
Mm-hmm.
definitely not a term I invented, but it's a term I adopted. And the reason why is that equity focuses on outcomes. Inclusion, which is a term that has often been used, and there were books on product inclusion, is like, let's get everybody in the room. But even if you get everybody in the room, it's the outcome that matters. So the equity focus is like, at the end of the day, are the people that are left out getting served? It doesn't matter if you brought everybody in the room.
Yeah, yeah,
If the result is not that it's made things better. And the problem with the inclusion approach is everybody's looking at, do we have the right people in the room? But it doesn't actually ensure that you're making things better. Whereas the equity focus is like, even if you didn't have, quote, the ideal right people in the room, it doesn't actually matter. And this is not to say you should not try to have the right people in the room, because the two are often very connected. But the point is, it just puts the focus on, because then it's like, how do we know if we're doing the right thing?
yeah,
How do we know if we're actually making things better? If it's the inclusion thing, it's like, oh yeah, we've got the right people in the room, so we're doing the right thing. But when you put the equity focus, it's like, are the people that are most likely being left out being served? Why people don't think about that, I think it's a number of reasons. One, as
mm-hmm.
I said, people think about things that are top of mind that they feel. And a lot of the people that are making the decisions, because of the way our society is constructed, are not the ones that are directly feeling the result of those decisions that are inherently have bias associated with them. The other thing I would say is, we, especially in the West, is we're capitalists, right? We're about making money. How do we move fast? Move fast, break stuff. That actually gets in the face of this, because break stuff often means we'll worry about those inequities later. ChatGPT is doing that right now, by the way. I mean, you look at, like I mentioned, Dr. Tim Neat, right? These people were raising the alarm and saying, hold up, like, based on what we see, these AI systems are packed with loads of problems. But, move fast, break stuff, we'll fix that later. And what have we found out? The cost of fixing that later has been astronomical. Many times, like, even like OpenAI at one point was like, we're not fixing it. Like, they've
Yeah,
scaled back their attempts to fix it because they realize it's not so easy to fix. So it's like this idea, I'm all about like lean startup, for example. But it's like, when you take that lean startup approach to suddenly be like, just ship stuff, throw it out there, like, it has lots of problems with it.
yeah,
Right? It has lots of problems with it, that basically often this idea of like, let's make sure it's not harming people that are maybe, let's make sure we're putting the right investment in to see that, like, who are the people that are most likely to get impacted negatively, and we can do something, or who are the people we're missing out on. Those things get thrown to the wall because there's VCs,
yeah.
like, imperative to like ROI, growth, etc. So I think it's, and it's like, that's why when we look at like racism, we look at misogyny, that's why you have to look at it from the systemic lens. Because
I
it's like,
agree.
we are a system that operates a certain way, and it just trickles into every area. And until you change or burn down the system, it's not going to change.
And we all have a role to play in institutionalizing the whole thing. So when you speak about the cost, that cost is not just economic. We are talking about the societal cost as well. We're talking about the environmental cost as well.
Yes.
And coming back to the equity part, which you mentioned, again, do you feel is for leaders and for many people in the community or a particular sector, it is more of a moral add-on, or maybe we could say, how do we go from it becoming a side initiative to a core product strategy? But then
Yeah.
I
And
know I
that's
know
one of the
what you've
things I
yeah,
work on.
yeah.
Yeah,
Because
I
you've
think it
also
happened.
mentioned, sorry, but you've also mentioned how equity is all about competitive advantage. So then how do you convince the leaders to see it as not just an extra, but very, very essential?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there is certainly a humanistic angle to it, which I think is a challenge, right? If you just try to
Hmm.
convince people like this is the right thing to do, regardless of the dollars, that
Hmm.
just doesn't fly in our society. And it's also challenging because if you try to go completely on the kind of ROI angle with this kind of work, then if the ROI is not there, the work stops. So
Hmm.
you kind of, have to kind of wait in between those two worlds. But ultimately, I think it's like, hey, the value of the product is directly connected to its ability to serve the users in a way that doesn't harm them and allows them to get the most value out of it. And a lot of my educating is really on that. Now, if you do that, though, there are benefits financially, right?
Hmm.
Like there's lots of data that shows, for example, that people will look for products, take like Black people will look for products that they feel where they're seen and will promote that in their communities, which will then result in better ROI,
Yeah.
right? So there is an ROI angle there, but ROI should not really be the focus. The challenge, if ROI is the focus, is will you actually do the work to deliver the right result that will give you that ROI, or will you be laser focused on the ROI angle in doing the work? That's those two very different things. So I think there's that.
Hmm.
Um, I think the liability is one angle, right? Which is like, hey, you can be sued as an organization if you harm someone. So there's always that risk. We see boycotts happening, right? Like, and some of those boycotts are related to harms
Hmm.
in technologies. And honestly, we can't talk about this whole thing that is happening in Palestine and Gaza and with AI bots that are shooting people and all these
Yeah.
other things
Yeah.
has really blown my mind. Like a lot of my look at equity was more about like how individuals are harmed, but it wasn't lit. And there were healthcare things like we talked about where somebody could die, but it wasn't talking about like annihilation of people
Yeah.
where technology is driving it. And I think that raises a whole other question around this whole product equity thing.
Yeah.
Um, it's
And
just
even
horrific to
yeah.
see
And
like AI based drones following children home and following parents home to then shoot them around their kids. It's like this is just
yeah.
not a thing I even imagined I would be thinking about, but
Yeah.
it's now a very real thing.
Yeah. And that all came to feature in the last 2 years, and it has become such a sort of a mainstream what we are seeing unfolding in front of
But
our
it built
eyes. But
up. It goes
yeah,
all the way back to
yeah,
dropping, to
absolutely, yeah, yeah,
drones in Afghanistan, right? Like people like to just blame, that
yeah.
country for everything, but
Yeah.
reality of it is often it comes back to the U.S.
Yeah, and
The
then
U.S.
even we
exports.
don't have to leave. We don't have to leave Palestine. We look at a city called Hebron, which you are very familiar with. Even before all of this, for the last 10, 20 years, how some of those things were sort of being used to
Yeah,
track, and amongst
and
the hundreds of
surveillance. I
checkpoint
mean, you have
surveillance. Yeah,
China,
yeah,
surveillance in
yeah,
China.
yeah,
All these like evil players have
yeah,
like shared their strategies and they
yeah,
come together and combine them, right? Like China, for example, has been doing tons of surveillance
yeah,
with technology. Even like Black Mirror type things with like credit systems, right? Like if you're seen doing a certain thing at a protest, you might have inability to travel. That hasn't
yeah,
hit us yet, right?
yeah,
But
yeah,
everything we see around the world comes home.
yeah,
And yeah, I mean the surveillance that has been happening in occupied Palestine is just
yeah.
horrific, and it's been building up to a critical mass, which after October 7th really went to a whole new level.
Yeah, and it has us, all of us, enraged in a way, which is why we are here talking about a lot of different things and looking at taking it from a systemic lens that way. But your philosophy is a real hope. I think, Glenn, that way, because you worked with people, who, and then you've also given that philosophy amongst your team members, where you specifically spoke about building the products for the overlooked, and then like you've been saying, it how benefits everyone. But what does it feel like being around that kind of strategy, around that kind of project management and innovation, if I may ask? When you're trying to do that, how does it feel like being amongst that, being part of that, leading that?
It's been very difficult recently,
Hmm.
especially living in the US with all of the, all of the shifting tides and, it's really hard to see the the whitewashing of history that is happening
Hmm.
across the board. And part of that is also the like, hey, we shouldn't be investing in this because this is not a problem that even exists, right? This is just a leftist
Yeah.
idea that these inequities exist. So that's getting very difficult. I think it's rewarding in the sense that um, feeling like I can have I can make a difference, even if just somebody listens to this podcast and they're like, huh, like I'm curious. Like I think there's a lot of product people that are curious.
Hmm.
And I focus a lot on, there's many different aspects of this problem. I focus a lot on product people because product is really where often in organizations like the vision originates.
Hmm.
Um, and a lot of times when people think about anything related to product equity, it's later down the line, like when the UI is built, do we have inclusive language or whatever? But the reality of it is, and this is the thing I try to shine a light on, and looking at several of those examples I gave, those were not things that decisions were made later that made a difference. Like it was very early from inception. If the oximeter from day one, they said, hey, we need to make sure this is going to work for people of all different skin tones, rather than assuming because it works for white people, it will work for everybody, you would have had a completely different outcome. If when Amazon was designing their AI system for recruiting that was biased against women, they had said from day one, we're going to make sure we're training this with data that is more balanced. We're going to evaluate and test. They wouldn't have ended up with a system that got canned right before it went live, called Amazon Insights, because of the
Yeah.
fact that it had inherent bias in it against women. So it's like, I try to speak to the product people so that at the earliest stage, these things can be thought about. That is really rewarding if I can find people that start to do that and then can see that they're actually delivering systems that are creating a better experience for people that before might not have had that. So I think there's definitely a rewarding aspect to it, but it is certainly a struggle. Partially, I think a big part of the struggle too, aside from the wins that are trying to prevent anything like this from gaining any traction, is there's just a very big lack of awareness.
Hmm.
Too often when I talk about this, I will get leaders that will be like, I didn't even know this was a thing. They're just like, what? Like, and I tell them some of the examples. And some of them are so close to home, they don't even realize it. Like a really simple one is like skin tone emojis.
Yeah.
Like lots of white people would be like, why do I need to see these skin tones? And they're like, this is stupid, like, whatever. But then you talk to people who really use those skin tones and who feel seen in a world where they're often not seen. And it actually makes a big difference in what their overall end experience is. That's very different than like drones killing children,
Yeah.
but it all is under that same big umbrella.
You had a famous story around the soap dispenser as well, isn't it? Which didn't recognize the skin tones.
Kind of similar to the oximeter, right? Same
Yeah,
idea.
yeah,
Less
and
less impactful, obviously. Like that person's not going to die,
yeah,
but they're not going to have a fair experience. And did cost a lot for the company because they
yeah,
had, hardware is always hard to fix.
true, true.
And so I think there is a cautionary tale about how this can cost you.
Yeah,
There was
but
an AI startup, for example, that had the first AI beauty pageant. This is
mhm,
another one that got a lot of noise because guess what? Guess who it was biased for? Guess who were the most beautiful women of those who submitted the images, right?
mm,
White women. Why? because of the training data.
Yeah.
So, that startup went under because of that. They're just a startup, but you can see this apply on multiple levels. So
Yeah.
there is, but the thing that motivates me, honestly, is not the ROI. It is really about like the humanistic aspect of like, do we want this to be a world? And there are some people that don't. And that's a challenge, right? Like we see what's happening in the US right now, what's happening with anti immigration, all of that. There are tons of people that feel perfectly fine with a world where, it fits for me, but doesn't fit for you. And where I can demonize you to make it logically feel okay that you don't have the same opportunities that I have. Personally, I do not want to live in such a world. So that's what motivates me to do what I do.
So I am taking, I'm sort of building on the fact that, and again, I'm taking the liberty of saying we are awakened here. But then there is a huge majority out there who would say the discussion we are having in terms of illustrating the systemic bias in the design, it is more of a technical bug rather than moral blind spot. So how do we convey, how do we talk to that group of people? How do we convince them? How do we tell them about this?
It's hard. No, it is really hard. Like you're right. Like there's the people that would say, "Oh, sure, there's some bias, but that's just an accident."
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Because it has
honestly,
taken a lot, hasn't it, for the entire tech industry to come this far, and
yeah,
we are at the periphery in terms of the AI. But yeah, it has
I
built over.
often, so I'll just be honest, right? You can spend massive amounts of time arguing with people and not
Yeah.
making progress. And when you're running a business, it also has deep implications. Like, I don't want to go down a path with clients that are not kind of aligned well with values. I look for organizations that are curious,
Hmm.
that are
Hmm.
like, I know there's things we can do better. We're just not sure how or what or why, as opposed to those who are like, this is not even an issue. Um, because over time, if you build a critical mass of those who actually see the problem,
Hmm.
that just historically extends out, right? So it will eventually trickle down, especially if those who see the value start to be able to actually show there is ROI to this. There was a Harvard Business Review study, which I linked to on my website. If you go to my Y product equity page on my website, which we can share the link on, that was studying what they were calling product inclusion. Again, I use product equity. It's still, I think it still ultimately comes down to the same thing, where they showed significant value
Hmm.
in those organizations that are building things in a more inclusive, equitable manner. And they give lots of examples on it. So there is ROI there.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the way I work. I try to really work with those. It's okay if you like think it's a bug, if you come with curiosity and are willing to say maybe it's not a bug, maybe it's a feature, and
Oh,
maybe we need to build, recognizing that that is a feature of the system that we live in, and we need to like work against it. Um, a great person who really impacted me as well is Dr. Ibram Kendi,
mhm,
um, who has written books on anti-racism, how to be
mhm,
an anti-racist. And he basically is like, you either are an anti-racist or a racist. There is no in between. Because those who say like, I don't see race, or this is not a problem, they're not doing things to stop the problem from happening. So you actually are, even if you don't think, you're actively perpetuating it. And reality of it is, when we look at these systems, the largest perpetuation is not from those who are actively working for it. It's those who just become part of the machine and just do it without thinking about it. I don't know if
and
that
that,
answered the question.
yeah, I
That was probably a
you
long
did.
answer.
And what I took away from everything which I've been reading about you and your work in terms of, again, coming back to this whole equity thing, you have approached it from a diagnostic perspective. So you don't see it as a design principle, you see it as a tool. And you're able to sort of tease out the power in whatever you design, I mean, whatever product which comes out. But then the question comes around the ecosystem, which in a way you have answered. Because when you're doing something like this, you've got this whole army of stakeholders behind you and in front of you as well. Um, don't you narrow down your options that way? And again, I would say Palestine in a way was a great enlightenment, in a way where you saw, I mean, despite the government and the institution all against, the real human issues, but then you have large population which are sort of, looking at and highlighting some of the flaws in our system. So for you, again, in
I just
your
want to
sector.
weigh in. Like, the hardest part actually about Palestine for me was the 10 years I worked at Microsoft, when
Mm,
I absolutely was in love with technology as being a leveler and, really making a difference in the world, and, actually work from Dr. Tim Need and others like Dr. Tim Need. There's this paper called the TESCREAL Bundle. I forget the acronym for TESCREAL, but it talks about these people that really look at technology as like the savior.
mhm,
And I think I believed that for a long time. And then to realize how much harm, these companies are at the center of, and of course, the paper that came out from Francesca, talking
mhm.
about the complicity of all these tech companies. It's just something that I used to love. It's just been really hard to digest, honestly.
Yeah. But then you have been a leader as well, Glenn, isn't it? And you've been in a room where sort of your decision or decision of your colleagues, it has affected so many people. And again, millions of dollars at stake, I believe. So how do you go about building a.
Billions,
Yeah,
billions in some
yeah, I
cases.
was I was being very modest there, but then, how do you build a culture around that? And especially in a very very high pressure tech environment, like you said, Microsoft, and other places as well. How do you make them empowered to ask those very uncomfortable questions?
Empowerment is a good one. So I think, there's one, people that do this work, there's kind of this idea of coming from the top down,
Mhm,
and the bottoms up approach, right? It really depends on the organization. Like, certainly if you can convince top down decision makers, that can be really ideal,
mhm,
because they can hold the rest of the organization accountable to kind of, do things in a different way. And I've seen success stories where that has happened.
mhm,
Um, the reverse is more of a bottoms up approach, right? Like, you're just trying to connect with champions within the organization that can then maybe start to show the value of this, and then it spreads. Both of those are different approaches that can be done. Um,
but which is
you know,
more
I
effective in your own sort of career you've seen and people you've come across?
I think well, I think if you can get yeah, it's a good question. I don't know that there's one right answer to that. I think both
Mhm,
can be successful. Um, I think if the leader is really bought in that this is valuable and viable, then they can, they have power to really like bring other leaders on board and say, this is what I'm expecting. And then that trickles down. Sometimes that results in the leader no longer being the leader. That can be a
mhm,
problem. And that has
mhm.
happened. In I had a very big contract that I was almost signing with a very big company. I'll just say, like, getting toward the $1 trillion mark in
Wow.
terms of how big they are. And we were in talks, and they were previously very excited about this work. And, then change happened, that resulted in leaders shifting, and those leaders basically being told, no, that's not the mandate anymore, right? So I think that's a risk of
Mhm,
the top-down approach, is
mhm,
that leadership can shift and then suddenly the priorities change. Whereas if you kind of are able to get in the hearts and minds of the people that are really doing the work, then those people will still have those thoughts even if leadership change. They might decide to leave, or they might find more creative ways to move it forward. So I think But of course, if you have a leader at the top and then it penetrates the DNA of the organization, then it no longer matters.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't think there's one size fits all. I think um, it's probably in a smaller company, it's kind of
Mm-hmm.
probably easier to get this
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing to happen. In a bigger company, yes, you're leading a massive organization. It's much harder to get everybody like lined up, and again, there's always the risk that people will work to try to oust you.
Yeah.
So yeah, I prefer to work with smaller organizations. This was
Yeah.
an exception. This was
Yeah.
a division within an organization that seemed very committed and aligned on values. I mean, ultimately for me, it's about the value alignment. Um, I want to work with people that are curious, that are willing to challenge. So, like, the biggest thing I think I can bring to the table, even with a podcast like this, I truly believe there's massive value in just challenging your own assumptions and asking questions.
Yeah.
And many of the examples I gave, I truly believe it's as simple as if somebody would just question things, that will have a result of doing things differently that could have a massive outcome. So I like to start there. I like to start with education about, here's examples like ones I gave you that show that this is not just some bug. This is part of the system. And here's why. And here's what we can do to counter that. And sure, there's a lot you can do, but starting with the essence and saying like, hey, if you just do this, you're going to have a better result. And it will cause you to do the things in service of that different decision that you made, versus like, here's some complex series of 500 different steps you need to follow.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is, and what you just mentioned in terms of questioning, and some of this, a lot of my listeners are, young entrepreneurs, looking to set up their own venture, looking out for those venture capitalists, in terms of how they bring on those funds and try to set up their own, journey. But then the question which comes from them is, how do you build? How do you build? And again, the question comes when you're building, you're thinking about scaling. How do you build without losing your soul when chasing that scale, whatever that may be? For some it could be thousands, for some it could be millions, and then going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets to the whole point of like the system working as designed. Like, I think,
Mm-hmm.
um, honestly, I think we really have to just step back and question a lot of
Mm-hmm.
things.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the capitalist mindset, the profit motive leads us to make a lot of decisions that ultimately hurt society
Yeah.
on the whole. So I honestly think like a lot of these things that I was even a big fan of, move fast, break stuff. That sounds great, right?
Sounds
Like,
very
and
sexy.
you got to
Yes.
balance, and you got to
Yeah.
balance, of
Yeah.
course. Like, I'm not saying do analysis paralysis,
Yeah.
but be more thoughtful. Like, if you're going to move fast, sometimes move fast is like thoughtfulness is about how do we make money? And I would challenge you to bring in more thoughtfulness. How do we break money in a way that is not going to cause more harm?
Mm-hmm.
Especially to those communities that continually are harmed. Because again, the ones that are not harmed, they continue to benefit. They're like, great, move
Yeah.
fast. ChatGPT, OpenAI, move fast. Google, move fast. So I think it's really about, yeah, maybe slow down a bit,
Mm-hmm.
be more thoughtful. Don't just assume that, the fact that we can get something out there that makes money is enough. And so I think it is a big cultural change of the way we think about things. And I don't have all the answers. I don't want to hand wave and pretend. I mean, it is a big problem, right? Like, a lot of the things that we see in this world today are a product of a general mode of thinking
Yeah.
that wasn't always that way. So those will be like, well, that's just the way it is, because we allow it to be that way.
Yeah.
We have to challenge that.
Yeah. We've let it happen in front of us. So moving away from the wider machine, that the wider sort of We are looking at system of investment and growth, which you just mentioned, which has actually shaped your industry. Because again, I teach a lot in terms of innovation and talking about the ideas of creativity. But essentially speaking, we are at a stage in that journey of the tech world where it's not about ideas of creativity alone. We are also talking about funds and who funds, why
VCs.
and why, what they are doing and why they are doing it. So it feels like, when we talk about funds, it has no conscience, like for example what you see happening in Gaza at the moment in terms of all those investment they're talking about, and the plans they've had for a very long time, and building all those sort of fancy Riviera and all that. But then no matter where you look at it, you look at funds, and even in the like I do I've had some discussion around with people in the third sector as well. Yes, we talk about capital, we talk about funds, but then there's no conscience around it. It just seems to be bandied around, no.
Money that
Yeah.
moves, and it's
Yeah. So,
ROI, right?
so what do you think of that? I mean, in terms of,
So if I had my druthers, one of the places where I think there's a chance to have a deep impact on the conversation we're having is those who hold the funds, the VCs.
Mhm,
We've already seen how VCs, and it's interesting in the latest climate what will happen with this, but after George Floyd, VCs started to stipulate that boards need to be comprised of people representing different life experiences, different ethnic backgrounds, different races, different genders. And there were some companies that were saying, hey, we're not going to fund you unless you're doing this. And I think those VCs have tremendous power. Of course, we also see them shutting down certain efforts that don't align with their values. I want to call out one VC that, and I mention him all the time, is uh, Transform VC, and
mhm,
Raed, who is the VC, who is Palestinian, by the way, and who founded his own VC company because he got tired of being told, like, hey, we're only going to support these things if you follow the values that we care about. But in the same way, so shout out to Raed, and I'm always sending him people. Um, but in the same way, when we think about like product equity, if VCs start to care,
mhm,
they can basically say to the companies that they're funding that, like, you have to care. We don't just care about your ROI.
mhm.
We care about how you're getting that ROI and who is getting harmed in the process, and the liability concerns too of like our brand, like how could our brand get hurt? Like if that care starts to happen at the level of the VCs, that can have a dramatic impact in the future, for future companies that are coming up now that might be the next Meta or
Yeah.
whatever. Um,
And this is where we talk about that cultural shift as well, isn't it? In terms of how we go about looking at those VCs, and also expecting, again, if you're a young startup, you would be looking to align your values. But then you also talk about accountability, Glenn, don't you? In terms of how how you must be willing to take responsibility for, I'm not just talking about harm, but in real companies that are sort of rewarded for speed and scale,
yes, yes,
rather
yes.
than reflection or just
I,
repairing
I
what is
think
wrong.
delivering equitable outcomes is 100% tied to accountability.
Hmm.
So the example I gave of like why I really attach to product equity versus product inclusion
Hmm.
is like product equity at the center of it. This idea of focusing on the result is about accountability. It's actually about holding yourself to account of like, are we addressing the needs of these communities? And if we're not, we need to do something different. Yeah, so I think the accountability thing is critical. Change won't happen, I believe. The right changes. Change will happen. Change always happens.
Hmm.
But accountability is all about saying, like, not just that change is happening, but that we're making sure they are the right changes and that we're willing to make changes if they're not. That's what accountability is all about. And so that's again why I really connect to the product equity idea. Because one of the things, even as I was engaging with this big company, they were very interested in is they're like, yeah, we're doing all this inclusion work. What we've not done a really good job of is tying that to why that makes sense for the business. And how do we know whether we should keep doing this thing or not? And so the product equity angle was appealing to them in that, and often when we talk about accountability, it's like metrics and measurements and KPIs, right? So, and this is something you hear also when you look at like true practitioners of DEI who are really trying to bring about a cultural change will tell you that if you're not measuring, you're just lying to yourself. You're just making yourself feel good. The measurement and accountability go hand in hand. How do we know if we're doing the right thing? There's got to be some way to measure it. Now, there are different types of measurement. You can do qualitative measurements, quantitative measurements. You can look at the apps. You can look at what are people saying about it. You can do interviews. You can do lots of different things. But the point is you need something. Otherwise, you're just kind of putting your finger in the wind, or you're just going through performative things that feel good, but that you don't know if they're actually having the result. Why spend a ton of money to do something? I mean, people do it because they're often not really interested in the change. They're interested in the appearance of change. So there's a huge difference between the appearance of change and actual change. Product equity is really focused on actual change.
In a way, we could also sort of look at it from an ethical recalibration point of view as well, isn't it? Because it pushes back against not only we are talking about the venture capital, but also leaders, like you mentioned, what
Totally.
progress actually looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
then you weave it into sort of looking at how it is strategy rather than more sort of
This is why I actually really prefer if I can get from the top. Because even if it starts from the bottom,
yeah.
ultimately to create that accountability, it needs to bubble up. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to bubble to the top of the organization. It could bubble up within a specific area. But to create that accountability often needs leadership at some level to back it, because often those are the ones who, are really in the position to create that accountability.
Change. Yeah. But then when you talk about leadership, do you think we're also looking at it from a power perspective, especially in the tech sector? Because if you look at the product more as a sort of a microsystem of the society, and then, how sort of it becomes a design choice, and not just politically, but then you look at the divide between the upper echelon and then the role the users,
Yeah.
ordinary citizens play in holding whoever to that account. So how can we move from, and when I say we, I'm talking about, because most of my work has been with the lower echelons, in terms of being a passive consumers to being that active participants in shaping whatever we are using and whatever is being thrown at us.
Yeah. So one of the things I work with the organizations that ProdSense engages with is pushing this idea of co-design, and that comes out of it's been around for a while. But when I mentioned that book, Design Justice, which I highly recommend by S. Cassandra Chalk, which talks about this idea of instead of designing for, you're designing with. Often, the way product works, and again, this is where you have to flip it on its head, is like product managers and other people, they go out and they gather a bunch of feedback and then make a decision. Here's what we want to do based on what we heard. But that actually has an inherent problem with it, because the interpretation of the data that you have collected is impacted by your own biases coming in. So I might think, based on the data I heard, that this is the right thing to do, when in actuality it's not. Who knows what the right thing to do is, are the people that are actually going to be affected. And co-design is actually about bringing these people that will be affected central into the actual creation of new products and services, so that they are actively making decisions and empowered to make decisions that will impact where that product or service goes. This is a huge change from the way we operate today. So it's not easy, but it does ensure that you're more likely to meet the needs of those who are being affected because you're working with those people to make sure that what you come up with addresses the needs. Is it perfect? No, but it's much better. Um, so that is something I try to promote within organizations, because if they start to do that, they're going to have a better result. I truly believe that.
There's a
Uh,
very strong
but
link to other sectors as well in terms of co-creation. It has got a
mhm.
very powerful um, symbol attached to it in terms of how empowering it is at every level as well. And so I now come to the last section, Glenn, and I'm very conscious of our time. This is a quick fire round where I'll be asking you three simple sort of, takeaways for our listeners, who come from all sorts of background. But then the first one would be one product you've seen which, according to you, in the current times, truly reflects that equity by design principle.
Cash App.
Cash up, all right, okay. What about a lesson,
But
a
I
hard?
also think Slack has done this with skin tone, with the way that they've incorporated skin tone emojis.
Okay,
Um, that's a smaller example, but I think it's good to have a spectrum of like Cash App. It's like foundational to how they built the app. Whereas, what Slack has done is looked at a particular aspect of their experience that could be better. And I think this is important because it's easier to be overwhelmed when you're like, oh, we have to like rewrite our entire app. I think there's a lot of things you can do in an incremental fashion, especially if you have something that's existing. But yeah, I think those are two great examples I often like to use.
thank you for that. The next one is your lesson about a young entrepreneur, or for a young entrepreneur, which they could learn earlier in their journey than much later when they're about thinking about scaling or sort of growing further, developing further. A harsh lesson, a hard lesson.
Well, a good lesson, which I had learned before I went in that paid off, was just about having a runway. Anything you're going to do, actually setting a timeline. So, like when I went off to do my business, um, I had one part of having a timeline is often having enough funds to do it. And in my case, thanks to all my years in tech, had saved enough where I was able to just be like, I'm going to go off and do this thing, and I'm going to give myself like a year to do it. And we have enough to get by. But sometimes one way to get a runway is you just do something on the side while you're working full time, and you work that way. But I think the runway is really important. One of the biggest lessons I've learned watching others and even in my own is, and it's something that does kind of come out of the lean startup thing that I will attract to, is being willing to pivot. Not just being stuck in your guns, so to speak, on like, no, everybody else is wrong, I'm right. Like being able to really like take in what you're seeing and evolve in the direction of where there's opportunity. I think that can be a hard lesson to learn, and some, especially startups, most startups fail. I think that's another
Yeah.
really important lesson. Majority of startups fail. All the data shows it. So we look at the success stories, but reality is the success stories are the anomalies.
So having that growth mindset is very important if you're a budding
Growth
entrepreneur.
mindset, I am such a
Yes.
huge fan, and I think there were periods in my life where I was more fixed mindset, and I think as individuals we often have some areas that were growth mindset and some areas that were fixed mindset. But that's a great point that you're mentioning, which is that importance to go in with a growth mindset. Yeah,
And
100%.
you've clearly demonstrated that, Glenn, in your own work. And I want to end this with a very positive hope for the next generation of entrepreneurs, especially in the tech industry? What would be your suggestion, or what would be your vision, the hope you hold on to for the next generation?
Well, I go back to what I said got me really excited about technology, that technology has the ability to do a lot of really good things. And so I would hope that our next level of entrepreneurs are actually recognizing that, hey, like if you're not proactive about it, like if you're proactive about it, that technology can do amazing things that really helps a lot of people that will be harmed if you don't do that. So just causing, I would say, more curiosity, more challenging of assumptions. I think if the people that build technologies in general did that, we would be a better world. And ultimately, that's why I'm in this and why I do this work with product equity, is to create a better world.
Glenn, thank you so much for this conversation. You've totally reminded us that technology, we've moved away from that neutrality part. Of course, it's a reflection of our priorities, as you've shown, and again, our blind spots as well, which is very, very important. And real innovation, especially for the future, it's not about all those algorithm or the code, but it's about your and my courage to build for those who've been left out of this progress. So you've shown us clearly with equity that it isn't a checkbox, it's a compass, and we all should follow it. We must just rediscover the original promise of technology, which you just mentioned, to serve humanity and not just market. And to all our listeners,
Awesome.
thank you so much for joining us. If this episode at all moved you, please share it. Ask yourself who you work for and who it serves, who it excludes, and how you can build differently. And until next time, keep listening, keep questioning, and keep building here in the Broken Bazaar. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.